What's up guys, Matt here. Today I've got a 2015 BMW X3, same vehicle that we worked on in the previous video where I talked about how we're going to retract the electronic parking brake on the rear brakes right here. If you missed that video, I would suggest taking a look at that because you're going to need to retract that electronic parking brake manually if you don't have a scan tool. So I'll link that up in the top right hand corner right now. But today we're going to be tackling the rear brakes. We're going to replace the rotors, pads, sensor wires, and all the other accessories that come with the ECS Tuning brake kit. As usual, I'll split this brake job into two videos, the rears and then the fronts, and I'm going to be showing you guys the passenger side rear because it has the pad wear sensor. Everything is identical on the other side with the exception of that pad wear sensor. So let's take a look. All right, full disclosure, I have never done this brake service before on this particular vehicle. Most brake services are very similar, but I wanted to let you guys know that this is my first time. I'm going to show you my procedure, but take everything with a grain of salt. I did just do the other side to get familiar with this vehicle, so I'm fairly confident in what I'm doing. However, if you have any apprehension at all, please consult a professional. Let's get into it. All right, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to disconnect the electronic parking brake wiring harness here. We can also remove it from the bracket on the back of this electronic parking brake. Now what I'm going to do is remove the pad wear sensor. So I can pull this out from this inner pad right here and follow it up, removing it from all of the clips. And this sensor wire goes all the way around this dust shield down onto the, looks like the lower control arm. And up, back into this box back here. Box opens up from the bottom, it swings up and allows you to pull out the connector for that wire. There's another tab on here. Press that down and pull the connector apart. And now we can remove this. There we go. All right, now we can work on getting the caliper removed. We'll have to remove the 13mm guide bolts here while holding the locking nut on the inside. This is a 15mm, this is a 13mm. But as I've mentioned in Volkswagen and Audi videos, standard 15mm wrenches do not fit on here. So I generally use this little needle nose wrench, and it really doesn't take a whole lot to hold this in place. That should do the job just fine. Okay, with the 13mm wrench, we'll want to break the guide pins loose. Okay, and we'll remove those. There's one. And two. At this point, we can pull the caliper and the electronic parking brake out of the caliper carrier. We're going to want to make sure to not put too much tension on the brake lines, so we'll be careful while we're taking this off to set this up on top here. And just for extra precaution, I'll put some mechanics wire through the spring just in case it does fall. It will be suspended here and won't overextend the brake lines. All right, so At this point, we want to compress the brake caliper piston, but the problem is this electronic parking brake is still obstructing the full retraction of this piston. So we need to back the pressure plate of this parking brake back all the way up so that we can fully compress this piston. With that done, we can go ahead and compress the caliper piston, but before we do that, we're going to have to lower the vehicle, pop the hood, and open up the fluid reservoir. And we'll want to put some paper towel around the fluid reservoir so when we do compress this and the fluid runs back up the lines, if that reservoir were to overflow, it would be caught in the paper towel rather than soaking the engine bay with brake fluid. With that fluid reservoir open, we can use just the standard brake caliper compressor tool, and we'll want to slowly compress this piston and making sure that this rubber boot is folding up nicely, making sure none of the rubber boot comes over the mating surface of this caliper piston. That can sometimes get caught between the piston and the pads, and then you'll have issues with the boot and leaking grease, and you'll have to replace that. So slowly compress this, allowing the fluid to run back up the lines. And once you feel resistance, you've got it all the way in. So pull that out, and now we're fully compressed. At this point, we can remove these pads if we want to. I'll go ahead and remove this outer pad. They just come on out. But we're gonna have to remove the caliper carrier anyway to remove the rotor. So you can just leave those pads in, and then when you go to replace all the hardware and stuff, that's when you can remove those, and you do it on the bench. It's just a little bit more comfortable than trying to work while it's on the vehicle. To remove the caliper carrier, there's two 16mm carrier bolts in the back. I'll be using a pneumatic impact driver to remove those, but a breaker bar should be sufficient to get back there and remove them. And I'll try to show you where those are located. It's those guys there and there. Now that we've removed one of these carrier bolts and this one's nice and loose, we can remove this. See, like I said, the caliper carrier and the pads will come out together. Then you can just remove these pads. I'll do that over on the bench in a second. At this point, we can use the 6mm Allen to remove this screw. If I was smart, I would have left the caliper carrier on so that I could have something to resist this from moving. But we're gonna try to remove this without that. Inertia. So there's the rotor retaining screw. Often the rotor will be seized onto the hub. I like to thread in a lug bolt, and then you'll hit this. There's an opening back here where the caliper sits, you can hit, and this will fall right off. At this point, just like to clean up the hub a bit. All right, let's hop over to the bench and work on the caliper carrier and get the new ECS Tuning kit ready for installation. The ECS Tuning kit obviously comes with a rotor. It's got your pads, and you want to notice that Although they look the same, one has a notch in here to accept the wear sensor, and one does not. And even though the wear sensor only goes on the passenger side for the rears, both sides will look like this, and so you'll want to make sure that this one goes on the inside of the rotor, and this one goes on the outside of the rotor. Your kit will come with new rotor retaining screws, inserts for the slides here on the caliper carrier. You'll get brake lubricant, enough for all four corners of the vehicle, and you will also get a replacement pad wear sensor. So this is a new guy. This is the one we just removed. If you look here, this guy is all the way worn down, and you can actually see the two little terminals that are popping through, which I'm assuming is what provides the current, that the car knows, hey, the pads are low enough where this thing is worn down, and that's how you get your warning inside the vehicle. So here you go. So as I said, you can wait until the carrier is out to remove the pads. This is the inside pad as compared to the new inside pad. You can see that they're very low. There's still some material on here, so it's not the end of the world. There's the old ones. And then we can start working on this caliper carrier. Pull the old slide clips out. These can be discarded. And what you want to do is line up the new ones in here and pop those in place. You want to make sure that it is pretty aligned with the carrier itself, because if this is touching the rotor, you're going to get a squeak that you'll basically need to remove the caliper carrier again to reposition these so that that squeak goes away. Same thing on the other side. These are pretty foolproof. The design of these makes sure that they're aligned properly. With those in, we can move on and we can actually lubricate these up. So, take some of this lubricant. And I just like to cover the surfaces here. And I like to make sure that I lube these before I put the caliper carrier back on the car, because it's pretty hard to get the lubrication where it needs to be without getting it on the brand new rotors while it's on the car. So just make sure you get lube in here. This is where the pads will slide. So these areas, not a bad idea to also lubricate the tabs on here that's going to be in contact with the carrier. And then I also lubricate the backside of the pad. Essentially anywhere that's going to be in contact where you could potentially have metal on metal squeaking. This is supposed to mitigate the squeaking. I have no idea if it actually works or not, but I do it anyway. Let's take a look at the slides themselves. I'm gonna take a look at these, make sure they look clean, make sure they look lubricated. In my opinion, these are perfectly fine and do not need any maintenance. So I'm just going to reinstall these. I actually just did a brake job on a Lexus IS 250 where these slide pins were completely seized up. As you can see, these move around very easily. If they are seized up, you're gonna want to remove them, maybe replace them, but definitely clean them up and re-lubricate them. So let's just take a look at this side as well. Yeah, these are very clean and look to be lubricated very well. Make sure we pop this boot back over the top. All right, now that's ready for installation, but first we're gonna want to install the rotor. I do want to mention that this rotor has a protective coating over the top of it, which does not require cleaning prior to installation. If you had a rotor that was bare metal, it's gonna look shiny and it's gonna feel like it's got some oil on it. Because it does have some oil on it, the oil is preventing the bare metal from rusting. You really want to get that oil off of the rotor before you install it. But again, this rotor has a protective coating over the top of it, which does not require oil. All right, at this point, I'm going to reinstall everything in essentially the reverse order of how we removed it. So let's get started by installing the rotor and installing the rotor retaining screw. Now we're going to want to reinstall the caliper carrier with the 16mm bolts coming through the back. We're going to want to be very careful to try to avoid you get any lubricant on the new rotor. So I actually switched gloves to try to mitigate any lubricant on the new parts. So let's go ahead and install these. Again, a spreadsheet for all the torque specs has been linked in the description below. So with the carrier on, we can seat the pads up against the rotor, making sure to put the pad with this little guy in the inside. All right, and at this point, now we can put the caliper back in the carrier and reinstall these guide bolts. All right, at this point, we can reinstall the wiring harness for the electronic parking brake. We want to make sure that we push it back into this little clip, and then push it in until it clicks. All right, at this point, everything is reinstalled except for the new wear sensor. So we'll want to go grab that, plug that in, and then feed it around all the way back up to where it plugs in up here. There it is. So we definitely lost some brake fluid. So what we're gonna have to do now, since we compressed all the pistons all the way in, pushed all the fluid back up into the reservoir, and obviously some of the fluid came out, now when we hit the brakes, all those pistons are going to come back out until they meet with the rotors. That means this fluid level is going to drop, and we have to make sure that that doesn't drop below the minimum fill level in the reservoir. So I'm gonna go into the vehicle, pump the brakes a few times, and we'll see what happens to that level. Just for your reference, the first pedal went straight to the floor and it started to get it more solid after that. I'm gonna have to get a flashlight so I can see the level of this reservoir. Okay, it's right up at this corner, that's why I couldn't tell where it was. So we've got plenty of fluid. I pumped the brakes a few more times. Now the pedal is completely solid. Yeah, we still have plenty of fluid. Push that on there. Reinstall the weather strip. This goes in those tabs and loops in down here. There we go. Last thing to do is to remove any service reminders or service warnings inside the vehicle. So what we'll want to do is go down into the bottom left hand corner of the gauge cluster. There's a button here. Push and hold until you see the service statuses pop up at the bottom. The brake fluid, reset possible, we're going to want to reset that one. So we're going to push and hold again on each service that we want to reset. So push and hold to go back to it. Alright, brake fluid, push and hold, reset, push and hold, and you can let go. You can see the status bar resetting. Now the brake fluid is good to go and you're not going to get a warning for that. Alright, the next one, rear brake pads. Alright, we have to go back into it, push and hold. Rear brake pads, reset possible, yes please. So we're going to push and hold, reset, push and hold, and we're resetting the rear brake pad warning. Okay, we've got the car on. Because we completely retracted the electronic parking brake, now we're going to want to engage that parking brake right here, and you should hear a fairly long cycle where the motor is running, and that's pushing that pressure plate back up to the pads. And then when we disengage it, it will disengage slightly, back off of the pads just slightly. Nothing like when we engage it. So let's give that a try. And just like that, the rear brakes are complete. If you have any questions, let me know in the comment section below. I can do my best to try to help you out, but again, this is just my procedure. This is by no means the official BMW procedure for the brakes. It's just something to give you an idea of what's going on with the brakes here on this 2015 BMW X3. Huge thanks to ECS Tuning, who helped me out with these parts. If you'd like to buy these parts yourself, I have links in the description below. If you go through those links, it'll take you to ECStuning.com. If you buy something, I do get a small kickback. It really helps keep this channel going. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.